Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we are going to look at a number that might completely change how you view global politics. You know, we so often hear about international conflict and the massive failures of global cooperation, but right now, we're going to look at the other side of that coin. We're going to dive into the fascinating, sometimes turbulent, but ultimately revolutionary evolution of international human rights. And that brings us to 93%. That is the astonishing average ratification rate of the core international human rights treaties today. Think about that for just a second. We're talking about an average of 179 state parties agreeing to documents that actively dictate how they should treat human beings. But as you can probably guess, getting the entire world to actually agree on this, it was anything but easy. It took decades of struggle, intense debates, and some truly profound tragedy. To understand how we reached this near-universal agreement, we're going to trace this evolution across 6 key chapters, starting with sovereignty versus rights, moving through the WW2 catalyst, the Universal Declaration, the shift from standards to monitoring, genocide and intervention, and finally ending with the power of norms. So, jumping right into Section 1, sovereignty versus human rights. We need to establish the baseline of how the world used to operate before World War II. For over 3.5 centuries following the Treaties of Westphalia in 1648, sovereignty was absolute. This meant that states were the ultimate supreme authorities. There was literally no higher political power that could intervene in a state's domestic affairs. The principal duty of every other nation was strict non-intervention. You simply did not cross a sovereign nation's borders to tell them how to govern their people. The big takeaway here is that human rights were strictly a domestic issue. Prior to World War II, there was a near universal global consensus that how a government treated its own people on its own soil was, quite frankly, none of your business. Even the Covenant of the League of Nations after World War I, which was incredibly idealistic for its time, completely excluded the term human rights. It just was not on the international radar at all. But that absolute, centuries-old shield of sovereignty was about to be violently shattered. This brings us to Section 2, the World War II catalyst. During World War II, the world largely turned a blind eye to the Holocaust. It wasn't until the end of the war, when the staggering mass murder of millions of innocent civilians, 6 million Jews, Roma, political dissidents, and so many others, was fully exposed, that the international community was forced to finally confront the horrors. The Nuremberg war crimes trials in 1945 did something totally revolutionary. They introduced the charge of crimes against humanity. For the very first time, government officials were held legally accountable to the international community for what they did to individual civilians. And this sparked a rapid cascade of standard setting. In just a few short years, we went from President Franklin D. Roosevelt framing the Allied goals in 1941 around basic freedoms, like speech, religion, and freedom from want and fear, to the creation of the UN Charter in 1945, which actually listed promoting human rights as a core purpose. This momentum carried straight through Nuremberg and culminated in 1948. Which leads perfectly into Section 3, the Universal Declaration. With the desperate need for global rules clearly established by the atrocities of the war, the world set out to actually write them down. In 1946, the UN created the Commission on Human Rights. And what's amazing here is the sheer diversity of the team that stepped up to draft this International Bill of Rights. Under the leadership of Eleanor Roosevelt, you had brilliant figures like Peng Chen-Sheng of China, Charles Malek of Lebanon, and Hernan Santa Cruz of Chile. It was a genuinely global effort. By December 10, 1948, the UN General Assembly adopted their work without a single opposing vote, just 8 abstentions, but absolutely 0 no votes. The result of all that work was the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Today, it holds a record 522 official translations, making it the most translated document in human history. It laid down a comprehensive set of civil, political, economic, and social rights, all resting on one incredibly radical foundational idea found right in Article 1. All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. Now, there was a catch. The Universal Declaration wasn't legally binding. It was more of a standard of achievement. To give it actual legal teeth, they needed a treaty. The original plan was to draft a single, massive covenant on human rights. But the draft became totally unwieldy, and by 1952, the UN General Assembly directed the Commission to split it into 2 separate treaties, one for civil and political rights and another for economic, social, and cultural rights. A lot of people naturally assume the Cold War ideological divide between East and West caused this split, but the documentary record tells a completely different story. The biggest divide by far was actually about monitoring. Most states were extremely wary of a legally binding treaty. They fought fiercely over UN oversight and whether the UN should even have the power to adjudicate disputes over violations. They liked the idea of the rules, sure, but they definitely didn't want the UN looking over their shoulders to enforce them. Despite those deep fears of international oversight, the tide was turning. Section 4, From Standards to Monitoring. The 1970s marked a real shift from just writing the rules to checking if states were actually following them. Because the UN is an intergovernmental organization, it only has the powers that sovereign states willingly granted. So early progress was pretty tentative. But in 1967 and 1970, new resolutions finally allowed the UN to openly discuss human rights violations in specific countries and even conduct confidential investigations into consistent patterns of gross violations. Then, in 1976, those two big covenants we just talked about finally entered into force, creating committees to actually monitor their implementation. As we pushed into the 1980s, the human rights regime expanded even further with some highly specific treaties. We saw conventions addressing discrimination against women, torture, and the rights of the child. And crucially, this massive explosion of international law corresponded closely with the real-world crumbling of repressive dictatorships. Throughout the 80s, military regimes in Latin America fell, and democratic transitions began sweeping across Asia and Eastern Europe. At the exact same time, non-governmental organizations were exploding in influence. Private groups like Amnesty International became massive players on the world stage, acting as fierce advocates for victims. They publicized violations, actively lobbied to alter state practices, and brought immense public pressure down on abusive governments. So much so that Amnesty actually won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1977. But writing treaties and lobbying governments wasn't enough to stop the worst of humanity. Section 5, Genocide and Global Intervention. The 1990s brought massive, tragic challenges to these newly established norms. During the Cold War, the tragic reality was almost universal inaction against genocide. And even in the 90s, the international community was initially paralyzed. In 1994, 750,000 Rwandans were massacred in a mere 100 days, while the world pretty much just stood by. But these dramatic, horrific failures finally galvanized action. The world revived the Nuremberg precedent, establishing ad hoc tribunals for Yugoslavia and Rwanda, which eventually led to the 1998 Rome Statute and the creation of a permanent international criminal court in 2002. This marked an unprecedented change in international relations. For the first time, in places like Kosovo and East Timor in 1999, we saw the consolidation of legitimate military humanitarian intervention. The global community was finally, officially recognizing that sovereignty is conditional, not absolute, when severe and systematic violations like genocide are happening. But, all this brings up a really crucial question for our modern era. Even with the ICC, the international system still relies heavily on states to enforce these rules. The UN doesn't have a global police force. So if the UN is structurally constrained and relies on the very states that often commit the violations, what is the actual day-to-day value of this massive human rights system? Let's uncover the profound hidden power behind these agreements in our final section, the power of norms. Here is why this whole system actually matters. Yes, implementing these rules remains almost entirely a national responsibility, but human rights are now fully internationalized. When repressive governments are criticized today, they can no longer credibly say it's none of your business. They've ratified these treaties. They've accepted the legal obligations. This decisively shifts the burden of persuasion away from the advocates and right onto the violators. Sovereignty simply cannot be invoked as an absolute shield against criticism anymore. Which brings us to our final takeaway. The principal legacy of this entire 80-year journey is a fundamental redefinition of what makes a government legitimate in the modern world. You just cannot claim legitimacy without acknowledging human rights. But as we face the 21st century with globalization threatening state capabilities and completely new geopolitical pressures emerging, we really have to ask ourselves, how will this normative force hold up? Will the paperwork and the promises be enough to protect us in the decades to come? Thank you for exploring this explainer with me today, and keep asking the tough questions.